Chapter 3. The Wild Animal. The wild animal was strong in Buck, and as he traveled across the snow, it grew stronger and stronger. And as Buck grew stronger, he hated Spitz more and more, although he was careful never to start a fight. But Spitz was always showing his teeth to Buck, trying to start a fight. And Buck knew that if he and Spitz fought, one of them would die. The fight almost happened one night when they stopped by Lake Laberge. There was heavy snow, and it was very cold. The lake was frozen, and Francois, Perrault, and the dogs had to spend the night on the ice, under a big rock. Buck had made a warm hole in the snow, and was sorry to leave it to get his piece of fish. But when he had eaten, and returned to his hole, he found Spitz in it. Buck had tried not to fight Spitz before, but this was too much. He attacked him angrily. Spitz was surprised. He knew Buck was big, but he didn't know he was so wild. Francois was surprised too, and guessed why Buck was angry.
"Go on, Buck,"
he shouted.
"Fight him, the dirty thief."
Spitz was also ready to fight, and the two dogs circled one another, looking for the chance to jump in. But suddenly, there was a shout from Perrault, and they saw 80 or 100 dogs around the sledge. The dogs came from an Indian village, and they were searching for the food that they could smell on the sledge. Perrault and Francois tried to fight them off with their clubs, but the dogs, made crazy by the smell of the food, showed their teeth and fought back. Buck had never seen dogs like these. They were all skin and bone, but hunger made them fight like wild things. 3 of them attacked Buck, and in seconds his head and legs were badly bitten. Dave and Sol-leks stood side by side, covered in blood, fighting bravely. Joe and Pike jumped on one dog, and Pike broke its neck with one bite. Buck caught another dog by the neck and tasted blood. He threw himself on the next one, and then felt teeth in his own neck. It was Spitz, attacking him from the side. Perrault and Francois came to help with clubs, but then they had to run back to save the food. It was safer for the 9 sledge dogs to run away across the lake. Several of them were badly hurt, and they spent an unhappy night hiding among the trees. At first light, they returned to the sledge, and found Perrault and Francois tired and angry. Half their food was gone. The Indian dogs had even eaten one of Perrault's shoes. Francois looked at his dogs unhappily.
My friends,"
he said softly.
"Perhaps those bites will make you ill. What do you think, Perrault?"
Perrault said nothing. They still had 600 kilometers to travel, and he hoped very much that his sledge dogs had not caught rabies from the Indian dogs. The harness was torn and damaged, and it was 2 hours before they were moving, traveling slowly and painfully over the most difficult country that they had been in. The 30-mile river was not frozen. It ran too fast to freeze. They spent 6 days trying to find a place to cross, and every step was dangerous for dogs and men. 12 times they found ice bridges across the river, and Perrault walked carefully onto them, holding a long piece of wood. And 12 times he fell through a bridge and was saved by the piece of wood, which caught on the sides of the hole. But the temperature was 45 degrees below zero, and each time Perrault fell into the water, he had to light a fire to dry and warm himself. Once, the sledge fell through the ice, with Dave and Buck, and they were covered in ice by the time Perrault and Francois pulled them out of the river. Again, a fire was needed to save them. Another time, Spitz and the dogs in front fell through the ice. Buck and Dave and Francois at the sledge had to pull backwards. That day, they traveled only 400 meters. When they got to the Hootalinqua and good ice, Buck and the other dogs were very, very tired. But they were late, so Perrault made them run faster. In 3 days, they went 180 kilometers and reached the Five Fingers. The other dogs had hard feet from years of pulling sledges, but Buck's feet were still soft from his easy life down south. All day he ran painfully, and when they camped for the night, he lay down like a dead dog. He was hungry, but he was too tired to walk to the fish, so Francois brought it to him. One day, Francois made 4 little shoes for him, and this made Buck much more comfortable. Francois forgot the shoes one morning, and Buck refused to move. He lay on his back with his feet in the air until Francois put the shoes on. Later, his feet grew harder, and the shoes were not needed. One morning, at the Pelly River, a dog called Dolly went suddenly mad. She howled long and loud like a wolf, and then jumped at Buck. Buck ran, with Dolly 1 step behind him. She could not catch him, but he could not escape from her. They ran half a kilometer, and then Buck heard Francois call to him. He turned and ran towards the man, sure that Francois would save him. Francois stood, holding his axe, and as Buck passed, the axe crashed down on Dolly's head. Buck fell down by the sledge, too tired to move. Immediately, Spitz attacked him and bit his helpless enemy twice, as hard as he could. But Francois saw this and gave Spitz a terrible beating for it. "He's a wild dog, that Spitz," said Perrault. "One day, he'll kill Buck."
"Buck is wilder,"
replied Francois.
"I've been watching him. One day he'll get very angry, and he'll fight Spitz. And he'll win."
Francois was right. Buck wanted to be lead dog. Spitz knew this and hated him. Buck started to help the other dogs when Spitz punished them for being lazy. One morning, Pike refused to get up, and Spitz looked for him everywhere, When he found him, he jumped at him. But suddenly, Buck attacked Spitz. The other dogs saw this, and it became more and more difficult for Spitz to lead them. But the days passed without a chance for a fight, and soon they were pulling into Dawson City on a cold, gray afternoon. They stayed in Dawson for 7 days. When they left, Perrault was carrying some more very important papers, and he wanted to travel back as fast as possible. They traveled 80 kilometers the first day, and the same the second. But it was difficult work for Francois. Buck and Spitz hated each other, and the other dogs were not afraid of Spitz anymore. One night, Pike stole half a fish from Spitz and ate it standing next to Buck. And every time Buck went near Spitz, he growled and the hair on his back stood up angrily. The other dogs fought in their harnesses, and Francois often had to stop the sledge. He knew that Buck was the problem, but Buck was too clever for him, and Francois never saw him actually starting a fight. One night in camp, the dogs saw a snow rabbit, and in a second they were all chasing it, with Spitz in front. Nearby was another camp with 50 dogs, who also joined the chase. The rabbit was running fast on top of the snow, but the snow was soft, and it was more difficult for the dogs. When Spitz caught the rabbit, throwing it in the air with his teeth, Buck was just behind. Spitz stopped, and Buck hit him very hard. The two dogs fell in the snow. Spitz bit Buck very quickly, twice, and then jumped away, watching carefully. The time had come, and Buck knew that either he or Spitz must die. They watched one another, circling slowly. The moon was shining brightly on the snow, and in the cold, still air, not a leaf moved on the trees. The other dogs finished eating the rabbit, and then turned to watch. Spitz was a good fighter. He was full of hate and anger, but he was also intelligent. Every time Buck tried to bite his throat, he met Spitz's own teeth. Then, each time Buck attacked, Spitz moved and bit him on the side as he passed. After a few minutes, Buck was covered in blood. He attacked again, but this time turned at the last minute and went under Spitz, biting his left front leg. The bone broke, and Spitz was standing on 3 legs. Buck tried to knock Spitz down, and then repeated his earlier attack, and broke Spitz's right front leg. There was no hope for Spitz now. Buck got ready for his final attack, while the circle of 60 dogs watched and crowded nearer and nearer, waiting for the end. At last Buck jumped, in and out, and Spitz went down in the snow. A second later, the waiting pack was on top of him, and Spitz had disappeared. Buck stood and watched. The wild animal had made its kill. Chapter 4. The New Lead Dog.
Well, what did I say? Buck's a real fighter, all right,
said Francois the next morning, when he discovered that Spitz had disappeared. and that Buck was covered in blood. "Spitz fought like a wolf," said Perrault, as he looked at the bites all over Buck.
"And Buck fought like 10 wolves,"
answered Francois.
"And we'll travel faster now. No more Spitz, no more trouble."
Francois started to harness the dogs. He needed a new lead dog, and decided that Sol-leks was the best dog that he had. But Buck jumped at Sol-leks and took his place.
"Look at Buck,"
said Francois, laughing.
"He's killed Spitz, and now he wants to be lead dog. Go away, Buck."
He pulled Buck away and tried to harness Sol-leks again. Sol-leks was unhappy too. He was frightened of Buck, and when Francois turned his back, Buck took Sol-leks' place again. Now Francois was angry.
"I'll show you,"
he cried, and went to get a heavy club from the sledge. Buck remembered the man in the red coat and moved away. This time, when Sol-leks was harnessed as lead dog, Buck did not try to move in. He kept a few meters away and circled around Francois carefully. But when Francois called him to his old place in front of Dave, Buck refused. He had won his fight with Spitz, and he wanted to be lead dog. For an hour, the two men tried to harness him. Buck did not run away, but he did not let them catch him. Finally, Francois sat down, and Perrault looked at his watch. It was getting late. The two men looked at one another and smiled. Francois walked up to Sol-leks, took off his harness, led him back, and harnessed him in his old place. Then he called Buck. All the other dogs were harnessed, and the only empty place was now the one at the front. But Buck did not move. "Put down the club," said Perrault. Francois dropped the club, and immediately Buck came up to the front of the team. Francois harnessed him, and in a minute the sledge was moving. Buck was an excellent leader. He moved and thought quickly, and led the other dogs well. A new leader made no difference to Dave and Sol-leks. They continued to pull hard. But the other dogs had had an easy life when Spitz was leading. They were surprised when Buck made them work hard and punished them for their mistakes. Pike, the second dog, was usually lazy. But by the end of the first day, he was pulling harder than he had ever pulled in his life. The first night in camp, Buck fought Joe, another difficult dog. And after that, there were no more problems with him. The team started to pull together and to move faster and faster.
"I've never seen a dog like Buck,"
cried Francois.
"Never. He is worth $1,000. What do you think, Perrault?"
Perrault agreed. They were moving quickly and covering more ground every day. The snow was good and hard, and no new snow fell. The temperature dropped to 45 degrees below zero and didn't change. This time, there was more ice on the 30-mile river, and they crossed in a day. Some days they ran 100 kilometers, or even more. They reached Skagway in 14 days, the fastest time ever. For 3 days the dogs rested in Skagway. Then Francois put his arms around Buck's neck and said goodbye to him. And that was the last of Francois and Perrault. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life forever. 2 new men took Buck and his team back north on the long journey to Dawson, traveling with several other dog teams. It was heavy work. The sledge was loaded with letters for the gold miners of Dawson. Buck did not like it, but he worked hard and made the other dogs work hard too. Each day was the same. They started early, before it was light, and at night they stopped and camped, and the dogs ate. For the dogs, this was the best part of the day. First eating, then resting by the fire. Buck liked to lie by the fire, looking at the burning wood. Sometimes he thought about Mr. Miller's house in California. More often, he remembered the man in the red coat and his club, the death of Curly, the fight with Spitz, and the good things that he had eaten. But sometimes he remembered other things. These were things that he remembered through his parents, and his parents' parents, and all the dogs which had lived before him. Sometimes, as he lay there, he seemed to see, in a waking dream, a different fire. And he saw next to him, not the Indian cook, but another man. A man with shorter legs and longer arms. This man had long hair and deep eyes, and made strange noises in his throat. He was very frightened of the dark, and looked around him all the time, holding a heavy stone in his hand. He wore the skin of an animal on his back, and Buck could see thick hair all over his body. Buck sat by the fire with this hairy man, and in the circling darkness beyond the fire, he could see many eyes, the eyes of hungry animals waiting to attack. And he growled softly in his dream, until the Indian cook shouted, "Hey, Buck, wake up!" Then the strange world disappeared, and Buck's eyes saw the real fire again. When they reached Dawson, the dogs were tired and needed a week's rest. But in 2 days they were moving south again, with another heavy load of letters. Both dogs and men were unhappy. It snowed every day as well, and on soft new snow, it was harder work pulling the sledges. The men took good care of their dogs. In the evenings, the dogs ate first, the men second, and they always checked the dogs' feet before they slept. But every day the dogs became weaker. Buck had pulled sledges for 3,000 kilometers that winter, and he was as tired as the others. But Dave was not only tired, he was ill. Every evening he lay down the minute after the sledge stopped, and did not stand up until morning. The men looked at him, but they could find no broken bones. Something was wrong inside. One day, he started to fall down while in his harness. The sledge stopped, and the driver took him out of his harness. He wanted to give him a rest and let him run free behind the sledge. But Dave did not want to stop working. He hated to see another dog doing his work, So he ran along beside the sledge, trying to push Sol-leks out of his place. When the sledge made its next stop, Dave bit through Sol-leks' harness and pushed him away. Then he stood there, in his old place in front of the sledge, waiting for his harness and the order to start pulling. The driver decided it was kinder to let him work. Dave pulled all day, but the next morning he was too weak to move. The driver harnessed up without Dave and drove a few hundred meters. Then he stopped, took his gun, and walked back. The dogs heard a shot, and then the man came quickly back. The sledge started to move again. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had happened.